Okay, you guys, we are back here now for video number 2. And in this one, we're going to outline the general sympathetic and parasympathetic responses. So the sympathetic response, right? This is the classic fight or flight response. This is the one when you're running for your life from being chased by the tiger or whatever you have learned about the sympathetic response. But the thing to remember is that it's activated under emergency conditions. And it's all about making sure that we have enough fuel on board and resources available to get you through this stressful situation and survive, essentially. It's all about survival. So I think for the most part, a lot of us can kind of think of things that would elicit a sympathetic response, you know, some sort of injury or trauma or accident or something along those lines. But what we don't maybe oftentimes equate with a sympathetic response is, you know, emotional states, fear or anxiety, or also just like any kind of positive emotional response as well. Another thing that we may not think about is hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is a big way to elicit a sympathetic response, which makes sense if we think about it because, of course, the brain is reliant on glucose for fuel, and if there's any decrease in glucose availability, the brain registers that as being like a severe emergency and then will kick into a sympathetic response. Also, temperature extremes, cold seems to be a little bit more indicative of eliciting a sympathetic response, but extreme heat could do the same, as well as exercise. Exercise is kind of a funny thing. You know, we're sort of conditioned to think that exercise is good, and it is in most cases to some degree, and it does very definitely elicit a sympathetic response, right? All the things that we think about with the sympathetic nervous system we see when we're exercising, whether it be an increase in the rate of the heart, increase in the force of contraction, increase in venous return back to the heart, contracting skeletal muscles, all of that stuff that we kind of think about with fight or flight. But oftentimes I think we don't always anticipate sort of the long-term effects of sympathetic stimulation, and we'll be talking about that a little bit as we get further on in the unit. Excuse me. Parasympathetic response, this is the classic rest and digest, or as I was taught, wet and juicy response, which is all about maintenance and relaxation. So this is what, after there's been a stressful experience and a sympathetic fight or flight response, this is the restorative side of it, right? So as one kind of ramps us up, the other brings us down. And that's one thing that we know about the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. In most cases, at our targets, and again, remember from the last video, the targets of the autonomic nervous system are the walls of all hollow organs, the heart, the muscle and the conductive system, and also glandular tissue. So almost all of the places in the body where we have autonomic stimulation, sympathetic or parasympathetic, we have both of them acting at the same location. The term for that is referred to as dual innervation. So a dual innervation just talks about how at a certain location, like let's say, for example, the GI tract, the smooth muscle that wraps the gut, that's dually innervated. So the parasympathetic nervous system will increase motility, and the sympathetic nervous system also has fingers in there, if you will, not really fingers, but you know what I mean. And that will have the opposing effect, which would be to decrease motility. In most cases where we have dual innervation, the two actions oppose one another. So if one were to increase an effect, the other would decrease the effect. And the goal of this, which we know, we might not have thought about it in this way, but the goal of this is to maintain balance, right? That's what homeostasis is. And the system in our body that is the best at maintaining that state of balance is the nervous system, right? That's how all of this is achieved, right? Because we have the ability to send messages to the brain about what's going on externally. The brain makes some sense out of it and then sends an outgoing message to correct for the abnormality or to correct for the imbalance, if you will, and to bring back some sort of state of balance. It allows the organ systems to sort of fine tune, kind of hone in on exactly what they need to do to, achieve optimal function. So this picture I like because it is a picture that kind of illustrates this concept of dual innervation. And we're going to get more and more familiar with the responses as we go through this unit. But I just right now would like you to, one, have this as a point of reference, but two, to sort of just eyeball what dual innervation really means. So you can see the different parts of the body, the eye, the trachea, the bronchioles, etc. You can see the different parts of the body, and you can see in red the parasympathetic response and in blue the sympathetic response. So that's what I mean by dual innervation. So if you just look right here at the eye in this section, what the eye will do under sympathetic stimulation is it will cause the iris to, basically the radial muscles of the iris will contract. And that means they shorten, which means it causes the pupil to dilate, right? That's what they say when they say wide-eyed with fear. The opposing action then would be achieved by the parasympathetic nervous system. So what the parasympathetic nervous system does when it kicks in is it causes the pupil to constrict, right? So the actions oppose one another. You can see at the airway, sympathetic stimulation will dilate the bronchi, whereas parasympathetic will constrict and will also increase secretions. We can see, you can see it all over the place. There are some places notable that are not dually innervated, and those areas are the adrenal medulla, and you can see the adrenal medulla is only red, so that's sympathetic stimulation, which makes sense because it's going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine in response to a fight or flight kind of a stimuli. The kidney, also sympathetic dominated, no parasympathetic response. It causes us to release renin, which is a big time vasoconstrictor. Also tends to stimulate our adrenergic receptors. And then on the far side of this slide there, over here you see the blood vessels. Blood vessels are one of the areas that we're going to talk a lot about as being known for only being controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system, when the sympathetic nervous system fires, the smooth muscle that wraps your arterioles constricts. When there's not a lot of stimulation by the sympathetic nervous system, they'll tend to relax a little bit. All right, so it's never like on or off completely, which sort of makes sense, right? So there's always some sort of low-level stimulation that causes us to have what we refer to as autonomic tone. So it's just some degree of autonomic stimulation in the absence of overt stimuli. Most places, with the exception of the vascular system, the predominant tone of the cardiac muscle, the smooth muscle of the airway, and the hollow organs and the glands, the predominant tone comes from the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system we really think as a kind of our tonifying system. So here's just some examples of what I'm talking about. And again, as we get going further and further, we're going to hopefully become more and more familiar with this. But here we have a picture, an abbreviated and simplified picture of the cardiovascular system. And we know that with sympathetic stimulation, we see an increase in the rate of contraction, an increase in the force of contraction, because we have receptors there that are hit by neurotransmitters of the sympathetic nervous system, which causes also an increase in blood pressure. So those are characteristic responses you would expect to see with sympathetic stimulation. So the heart is dually innervated, and what we see with parasympathetic stimulation predominantly is a decrease in the heart rate, maybe a slight decrease in contractility, but it's very slight. The parasympathetic nervous system is really regulated to the nodal tissue, the electrical tissue in the heart, namely the SA node, the sinoatrial node, and the AV node. But you can see the actions oppose one another. Sympathetic increases heart rate, parasympathetic is going to decrease heart rate. Here's an airway. Sympathetic stimulation is going to dilate the bronchioles, get more air down there when you're running for your life. The parasympathetic is going to constrict the bronchioles, also going to increase secretions in the airway a bit. Here's that slide with the secretion. So this is our airway. That's the columnar epithelial tissue, the ciliated columnar epithelial tissue, which has got an abundance of goblet cells producing a bunch of mucus. And the parasympathetic nervous system, that's the wet and juicy one, right? That's why I like that. It helps me to remember. So it's going to make everything more moist and more secretion, more mucus, etc. The sympathetic nervous system tends to decrease secretions on the whole. Here we have the GI system. Sympathetic nervous system is going to decrease motility majorly, and also the tone of the overall tone of the GI tract is going to be diminished with sympathetic stimulation, and the sphincters, wherever we have them, which is all over the place in the GI tract, are going to contract, with sympathetic stimulation. The parasympathetic effect is going to be opposed. So we're going to see an increase in motility, an increase in tone, and a relaxation of our sphincters. Here's a picture of the bladder, genitourinary system. And again, the actions are going to oppose one another. Sympathetic stimulation is going to release the wall of the bladder, contract the trigone and the sphincter. The parasympathetic nervous system is going to cause contraction of the wall of the bladder, relaxing the trigone and relaxing the sphincter. So the actions, this is dual innervation. Again, they oppose one another. We've got the eye. I said this earlier, but you can have the picture. So sympathetic stimulation is going to affect the iris of the eye, the radial muscle, which the fibers run kind of like the spokes of a wheel. When they are hit, they are going to shorten, which is all muscles can do. They're going to shorten, and that's going to cause the pupil to dilate, right? So the radial muscle is the target in this case, and it's going to see pupil dilation. The parasympathetic is going to be a different muscle. When it stimulates the sphincter muscle, which is the muscle that wraps around the eyeball here, or the pupil, pardon me. That's the sphincter muscle. And it causes that muscle, parasympathetic stimulation is going to cause that muscle to shorten, and when that happens, it causes the pupil to constrict. Vision also is affected by the autonomic nervous system. Distance vision, when you're running for your life, right, you want to be able to see where you're going, right? You don't want to be able to just like sit and see right in front of your face. So what has to happen is the ciliary muscle is the target, and what ends up happening is it causes the ciliary muscle to relax, which allows for the lens to flatten, right? In order to see at a distance, the lens needs to be flatter. With the flip side of this, with parasympathetic stimulation, we see a contraction of that ciliary muscle, which puts tension on those suspensory ligaments, which causes the lens to round up. And when the lens rounds up, we're able to accommodate for near vision, right? So that's the time to be able to read. You have to be fairly relaxed. You can't be running, you're not running for your life and then all of a sudden, I'm going to stop and read for a minute. That's not the way it works, right? It's a very different kind of an experience. So again, these actions oppose one another. In most places where we have dual innervation, and I don't think there's any exceptions to this that are coming to mind, at least. In all places where we have dual innervation, one system is going to increase or decrease, and the other is going to do the opposite. It's going to have the opposing effect. So we can really dial it in, and if you're thinking ahead to drugs, we have to kind of, in my experience, where people get the most confused, or they where this all starts to kind of go bad, is when we forget to think about dual innervation, because we can approach these targets from either division, right? You can approach a target from the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division, but you have to know this concept of dual innervation in order for that to be achieved. Okay, more on that later. This is a picture of the radial muscle of the eye, which is just a cool picture under super high resolution. You can see how the fibers of the muscle are running like spokes of the wheel. Okay, so now we sort of have the setup, hopefully, right? So if you're still unclear on the overall setup of the nervous system, the divisions of the nervous system, and the general responses to sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation, now is the time to kind of like regroup and get solid on that. Because where we're going next to is, okay, how do we first generate these messages, and ultimately how are these messages communicated? And that brings us to the next hurdle, which are the neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters, as I'm sure you know, are chemicals that are in most cases secreted either in the cell body or in the terminal portion of the neuron. and their job is to bridge the gap, right? I said, I think sometime at the beginning of that first video, that we have two kinds of communication happening, or two kinds of transmission, I guess we could say. We have the electrical signal that's generated, and that's all about action potentials, right? That's all about sodium channels opening and potassium channels opening, right? And the influx of sodium, the efflux of potassium, and all that. But then when you get to the end of the neuron, we got to get that message from the end of that neuron to either the next neuron in line, if we're talking about the end of a preganglionic neuron and the beginning of a postganglionic neuron at a synapse or at the ganglia, or if we're talking about the end of the postganglionic neuron and the target. In both of those cases, that communication, that conversion of the electrical signal ultimately into what would be the relay of the message, relies on the release of these chemicals called neurotransmitters. So we're going to have to know where they come from, and like I said, in most cases they're produced by the preganglionic neuron cell, by the cell body, or they're made in the terminal portion of the axon, and they're stored in little vesicles, right? And there's different ones, of course, right? It wouldn't make sense if the same neurotransmitter was released everywhere, because then it would just be a mess, right? We'd have just one response happening. So they're selective for their specific responses. So we're going to be familiar with lots of neurotransmitters, but the two primary neurotransmitters, not the only neurotransmitters of the autonomic nervous system, but the only two that we're going to really talk about, are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. So that's where we're going next. The next video is going to be all about the synapse and these receptors and what happens, how we can interface with these receptors. So that's the next on our list of things to learn. But for now, we are good, and I will see you at the next video.